Hello, this is Martin Carkson. I'm a communication studies professor here at Colorado State University. I'm going to do a short video on the Toulmin model. This video is primarily for our public argumentation classes, but we'll share it more broadly. Stephen Toulmin was a philosopher and argumentation scholar kind of in the 20th century, developed the Toulmin model, which is a very useful tool to really think about the quality of arguments and really be able to analyze arguments. In particular, to be able to kind of divide arguments up into its component parts and really think about some of the underlying assumptions that are inherent to arguments. The idea of making some of the implicit assumption or rules that are tied to an argument explicit, putting it on the table, allowing people to really kind of engage the argument. This is such a critical skill, particularly now in the 21st century with data kind of all over the place and arguments and concerns about post-fact society and those type of things. I decided to do this video in particular because when I used to teach the class, I always did an extended evaluation at the end of the semester. And two of the questions I would put on there was, one was, what's the most useful concept you learned in this class you think will be useful for you kind of beyond college? And another one was, what's a concept in here that you still don't get or doesn't seem very useful? And the Toulmin model often kind of won both of those questions. So it seemed like half the class, it seemed very useful and applicable. And for half the class, they just didn't quite get it. So I'm doing this video to kind of help out the instructors and help out the students to have something they can kind of go through and hear me kind of talk through it. They can watch it more than once if they need to really kind of get a sense of how these arguments, how this model works and how it helps. Because I do think it should be something that applies certainly beyond the class and should be useful in lots of your other classes as you write papers and projects and think about the argument that you're making and how you kind of strengthen that argument. And certainly while you're researching, while you're analyzing other people's arguments to decide which arguments are most powerful to include and how to kind of critique arguments in productive ways. So I'm going to share my screen here real quick. So this is the basics of the Toulmin model, and I'll put in the first comment on YouTube, I'll put a copy of this PowerPoint. So if you want to pause and print it out, so you can write notes, feel free. I'll also kind of create a PDF of the relevant pages from the student workbook if people are not in the class but are checking out the video. So I'm going to cover four things today, just for the basics of the Toulmin model. The three key parts of the model. There's other parts of the model that the coursebook kind of covers, but I'm going to focus really just on the three main ones, which is claim, evidence, and warrant. And then I'm going to connect it to the three general tests of all argument, which is what I think the primary use of the Toulmin model is for us to, again, evaluate the quality of arguments in important ways. And I'll touch briefly on concepts of argument chains and argument trees and how the Toulmin model helps us think about that. But when you look at the basic Toulmin model, one way you can think about the Toulmin model is kind of like diagramming sentences that some of y'all might have done kind of in elementary school, right? So it's taking an argument and putting it into its component parts so it's easier to kind of analyze and critique as you go through it. So the first part of the Toulmin model is basically the claim. This is the argument that you're making, that you're advancing, that you're wanting someone to believe, right? This might be a factual claim, a claim of truth or fact that you're trying to establish. It might be a value claim that you're trying to say something is good or bad or desirable or whatever, or it might be more of a policy or an action claim or a prescription of we should do this kind of thing, right? So it kind of works with all those types of claims. The second part is some sort of evidence or grounds or support or data, right? So some additional information that you're providing that supports that claim. And as we'll talk about, the idea is that there's a strong connection there. People will more likely believe your claim because of the quality of evidence. Right? Then the third part, which is the most important part, and kind of what students get the most confused about, is the warrant. And the warrant is the reasoning. The warrant is, why does that evidence advance that claim or support that claim? The warrant is often unstated or implied. It's often kind of an underlining rule. And a key skill for analyzing the quality of arguments is to bring out the warrant, to figure out what is the underlying assumption. So let's kind of play with an example here. Perhaps I'm making the argument that I believe women, or I'm making a claim that women are better drivers than men, right? So it's the claim that wanting people to believe. The evidence I provide for that is that women get in less wrecks. Both of those are an explicit part of my argument often, right? I'm going to say, I think women are better drivers than men because they get less wrecks, right? And that might be simple sentence I give. Well, the warrant here, and I put this in parentheses, is again because the warrant is often unstated. But there's an assumption there, and in the warrant, the framing of the warrant, there's not an objective kind of right way to do it. That could always be worded in various ways, but it tries to take the kind of inherent argument with between the claim and the evidence and bring that out clearly. Right, so here, a criteria of good driving is avoiding wrecks, or it might be even simply saying, getting less wrecks means you're a better driver, right, or you're a good driver. But that's the inherent assumption that underlines that argument. So that's the basics. Those three things can take you a long way of thinking about different kind of arguments, right? What's the claim, what's the evidence, and then what's the inherent warrant? With the claim and the evidence, often but not always kind of explicit to the argument. It's part of the text in a sense. And the warrant, often but not always, kind of implied. So you can think about someone trying to convince you to take a certain class, right? So the claim might be, oh, you should take this class. The evidence might be, oh, because it seems so useful, or it'll look good on your resume, or it's a total blow off, or the professor's great. Each of those are different kind of points of evidence that people are using to advance the claim that you should take the class. And then each of those specific points of evidence would have its own warrant, right? The warrant might be, you should take classes that look good on a resume, or you should take classes that are taught by good professors, or you should take classes that are blow-offs or that are easy. And just that simple fact, again, of making the implicit explicit, put something on the table that helps you kind of look at it and analyze it. Another example might be trying to convince someone to buy a car, right? Again, you might say, hey, you should buy this car, which is the claim. The evidence might be because it gets great gas mileage, because it looks great, or because it's has won safety awards, or all these different kind of evidence. Each of those, again, has its own warrant, underlining assumption that you should buy cars that are safe, or you should buy cars that have good gas mileage, etc. One thing that we talk about a little bit is when you're wanting to be a critical thinker and kind of use argumentation theory, you want to make that implicit explicit. You want to think about the underlying assumptions and rules that are given. If I'm a marketer, or if I'm a professional persuader, I'm trying to convince you, I often want to narrow your thinking, right? I want you to only think, if I'm basing my claim on safety, I want to sell you a car because of safety, I want you to narrow your thinking that safety is the only thing that's relevant, right? Whereas if you're a critical thinker, or you're trying to kind of tackle wicked problems, you often want to expand your thinking and think about all the different rules. And that's why bringing out the warrant's important, because you realize often that it is, in some senses, a narrow argument. Right? The other concept here, and this is a theoretical concept, but the idea is, your claim, if you're trying to convince someone of a claim, they don't already agree with the claim. That's why you're trying to convince them, right? The idea is that, so the claim is above the level of agreement. They don't necessarily agree with that, but the evidence they should agree with the evidence. And that becomes the power, in a sense, of how do you connect the evidence with the claim. You're connecting something they already agree with something you want them to agree with. And if that connection is strong enough, then that level of agreement would actually increase. And now all of a sudden the claim is something they believe as well. So there's another way of thinking about that you're trying to move that level of agreement. We'll come back to that because with certain arguments, particularly complex arguments or controversial arguments, just one piece of evidence with a warrant is probably not enough to kind of get them to accept the claim. So there's going to be other ways that we think about that. In the same sense, sometimes people might push back on your evidence and not agree with that. So then you have to rethink where that line of agreement is. The second key point I wanted to cover today is this notion of the three general tests of argument, right? So these are 3 points that for every argument you should kind of automatically be thinking. Generally, I think people tend to do A on their own. Whether they do B kind of depends sometimes, and then C is often kind of where people struggle. And this gets back to that notion of thinking more broadly about underlying values and the rules that might come in. Looking at this basic argument of women are better drivers than men, the first rule, the first test is, do you believe the evidence? So looking at the claim or the point that women get in less wrecks, do you believe that? Does that seem true? Does that seem acceptable? Right? If that is acceptable, then you can go to the next test of argument saying, well, is it relevant? Does the amount of wrecks you get in really have something to do with how good of a driver you are? Right? In that case, it's a pretty decent argument that yes, obviously good drivers should avoid wrecks. And then the third test is, to what degree is the warrant sufficient? The first 2 tests are basically internal to the argument, right? That you're looking at the actual text of the argument and kind of see if it works internally. The third test, to what degree is the warrant sufficient, is external, right? It's saying not only is the warrant relevant and acceptable, does it make sense, but is it sufficient? Is it enough for me to say that, yes, I believe women are better drivers than men because of the specific fact that they get less wrecks, right? Very rare that any kind of individual argument would be sufficient on its own, right? So the third test is a pretty kind of tough test in a sense, and it should kind of lead to thinking about other aspects. What are the other criteria of good driving that might not be completely disconnected to wrecks in some ways? And that's an important part for us to kind of really think about the strength of an argument of, how does it, what rule does it set, and what other rules kind of apply there that we might kind of think through as we go. Right? Getting back to this idea of the initial level of agreement, right? So what happens if, you're making the argument that women are better drivers than men because they get in less wrecks, and someone challenges your evidence, right? The idea is evidence should be something that people generally agree with. So if they challenge the evidence, all of a sudden what happens is the level of agreement is actually below the evidence, which is a problem. So in some ways, that point that women get in less wrecks than men serves primarily as evidence for claim A, and we kind of use these vertical kind of charts in a way to kind of think through that, but then it also becomes a claim in itself, right? So if you're wanting that argument to really support your claim that women are better drivers than men, then now you need to support that argument. So perhaps you come up with evidence of the claim that women get less wrecks than men with, well, National Transportation Association statistics show that women wreck less than men. Right? Well, hopefully that is within the level of agreement that people trust the National Transportation Association. Perhaps you have some stats there to kind of show them in the years to do that. So that now the warrant here, right, if we're making the claim that women get less wrecks than men with the evidence that National Transportation Association stats show that, the warrant would be, we should trust National Transportation Association statistics, right? That should be something that supports that claim. So a lot of credibility claims, the warrant is the credibility, right? You do something because your doctor told you to do it in a sense, and the warrant because should be that you should trust your doctors. So the idea with this becomes an argument tree in a sense, that a claim and evidence is going to build on top of each other. So the level of agreement, if people trust the NTA, therefore they should trust your point that women get less wrecks than men. If they trust that point, then there's some power for them that to also support your initial claim that women are better drivers than men. That level of agreement kind of moves up different points. Theoretically, someone could say, well, who the heck's the NTA? So all of a sudden, that point on the bottom becomes a claim that needs its own evidence for you to kind of support and build the credibility of the National Transportation Association and why we should believe their statistics. Right? But you can see how an argument chain, built on top of each other, can be pretty precarious, right? Because each claim is relying on the evidence below it. If anyone kind of refutes any of those points of evidence or any of those warrants, the whole thing can kind of come tumbling down. Right? So generally with a long-term argument, you don't want just an individual chain that build up on each other. You want more of an argument tree. So in most cases, when you're making claims, you're going to provide several points of evidence. And each of those points of evidence would have its own kind of implied warrant. So I'm making the claim that you should buy car A, right? I might have evidence in terms of, well, because it's safe, because it's got great gas mileage, and because it has great resale value. Right? Each of those points of evidence, there's a warrant. You should buy cars that are safe. You should buy cars that have great resale value. You should have cars that have good gas mileage. If someone questions one of those points of evidence, like, I don't think it's safe, then that point that it's safe becomes a claim that you would want evidence for, right? That you would say, well, here's some awards that it won for safety. Here's how many airbags that it has, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what eventually happens with complex arguments is you might have one big overall claim, and then you have a structure of evidence behind it. And again, for those in the middle, it serves as an evidence for what's above it, and it serves as a claim for what's below it. And the basic idea, I have a simple structure here of three subclaims and then 3 points of evidence for each of that. A lot of times in arguments, it's not going to be that simple. The general idea is if the claim is not that controversial, then you probably don't need that much evidence. People already agree with it, so don't spend too much time on it. If something's more kind of controversial, you're going to want to spend more time on it, right? So you might have, for a few of these on the bottom, if you think people might kind of not be too sure about that, you might have additional kind of arguments kind of building below that as you go. But the overall idea is it all kind of builds from the basic structure of claim, evidence, and warrant, the kind of the atom in a sense of the argument. And when you're building complex arguments, you're cobbling those together in kind of a broad way. The other nice thing about an argument tree, when you have several different arguments, is each of those warrants kind of depend on people's what's important to them, their values, right? So what's more important, kind of mileage or safety or resale value? So if you have a complex argument with several different evidences, points of evidence, then warrants work better because certain people see other certain things kind of as more important as you go through. This is the basic idea of, in the class, you'll be building these arguments of how to deal with these different work problems with different approaches. This kind of is a structure of each approach in a sense. But later on, when you're in upper level classes and you're writing papers, you can look at your paper as an argument. Your thesis statement is making a claim, and the rest of your paper in a way is trying to support evidence for that claim. You might have several sections of your paper which each kind of outline one particular kind of strong, broad kind of point of evidence for that overall claim, and then that section provides additional evidence to support that claim as you go through. So argument is something that should kind of cut across a lot of your different classes as you think through and work as a communication studies major. Right? So to finish this off, overall the toulmin model, the idea is kind of like the diagramming sentences, taking an argument and kind of putting it into its kind of different parts in a way, and that helps uncover the hidden assumptions. It makes the implicit explicit in a sense. Oftentimes you can see that it is a pretty strong warrant. Sometimes you see it's a pretty weak warrant. I used to do exercises in class where students would have to watch commercials and try to analyze it with the toulmin model. And the overall claim for any commercial, sometimes implicit, is you should buy this product. And then the rest of the commercial provides evidence and arguments in some ways of why you should. But so many commercials are just kind of lifestyle commercials that just show the product being used, people having fun at the beach playing volleyball. And it's not, all of a sudden the warrant gets really complicated and confusing because the reason you should buy this product is because you'll get to go to the beach and play volleyball, which doesn't make sense, right? The other nice way to kind of play this is just next time you're at the grocery store, product packaging is all kind of, obviously they want you to buy the product, and then the messages on the packaging in some ways are points of evidence. So to kind of think about what are the warrants that kind of are inherent to that, right? How are they trying to sell you the product? What are the points that they're making? To what degree are they providing evidence for it or not, right? And then last, the point, what toulmin model allows you to do is really think about those three key tests of argument. So not only the validity of the evidence, which becomes natural to us of thinking about, do we agree with that evidence, but both the relevance, how much does that evidence really support the claim, and then the broader kind of external question of sufficiency, how powerful is that warrant? What are the other potential kind of assumptions we can make as we think through the argument, and that might be relevant from a kind of a wicked problems mindset. So hopefully that was useful. It's just a start to kind of think through the value of the toulmin model. The course book has several other examples, and then makes some additional connections to rules of logic and deductive and inductive and analogical reasoning. But that's kind of an initial kind of look at how the toulmin model might work. Hope it was useful. Thank you.